Deep in the shadowy crypt beneath Madrid's royal palace, surrounded by flickering silver candelabras and rich crimson drapes, hides what's rumored to be one of the creepiest secrets of Europe's crowned heads. It's not some glittering treasure, a missing crown, or even the preserved heart of a holy king. It's something way more private. For over 200 years, whispers in the palace corridors have claimed that when Spain's Ferdinand Vii passed away in 1823, a particular piece of his body was cut off and stored in a glass jar of alcohol. It wasn't his guts or his brain, but his manhood. This tale, murmured in hushed tones and scribbled in secret histories, has turned into one of the weirdest and most uncomfortable legends in Europe's royal past. Could it really be true? Was this truly the final emblem of Spanish royal manliness, kept in a bottle like some grim prize? And why, out of all Europe's kings, was Ferdinand VII remembered not for battles won or laws passed, but for the supposed fate of his private parts? To make sense of this wild and gripping story, we've got to dig into the life of one of Spain's most hated and debated kings. Ferdinand VII wasn't just a monarch to his own people, he was a spineless backstabber and a cruel ruler, a guy whose shaky masculinity mirrored an empire that had long lost its glory. Born in 1774 to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand grew up in a Spain that was a shadow of the mighty seafaring power it once was. The Spanish Empire was crumbling, its American colonies were slipping away, the British had crushed its navy, and the economy was teetering on collapse. To top it off, revolutionary France and later Napoleon's armies loomed over the Iberian Peninsula like a storm cloud. From a young age, Ferdinand showed a troubling streak. He was notorious for being timid, disloyal, and incapable of sticking by anyone for long. As the Prince of Asturias, he schemed against his own dad, even penning secret notes to Napoleon Bonaparte, begging for help to topple Charles IV. This betrayal of his family was just the first of many acts that earned him the title of King Traitor. In 1798, when he finally pressured his father to step down and grab the throne, Ferdinand's reign lasted barely 2 months. Napoleon, playing the Spanish royals like pieces on a game board, called father and son to Bayonne, France. There, in one of the most shameful moments in royal history, Ferdinand handed over Spain's crown to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, for a French pension and the promise of a fancy chateau. While Spaniards fought a brutal 6-year war against French invaders, their so-called king lived it up as a guest at the Château de Valençay, throwing lavish dinners, strumming musical instruments, and charming French court ladies. This gutless behavior was the ultimate stab in the back for the Spanish people. As guerrilla fighters risked their lives in the mountains for their country, Ferdinand was feasting on oysters and toasting with champagne alongside his captors. During this cushy exile, the first rumors about the king's questionable manliness started to spread. French diplomatic letters tucked away in archives dropped subtle hints about the Spanish monarch's personal flaws. These weren't just about his political cowardice, some suggested issues with his physical masculinity. A few French writers of the time even implied Ferdinand might have been impotent, which could explain why he swapped a throne for a life of shallow pleasures. When Napoleon finally fell in 1804, Ferdinand came back to Spain, not as a triumphant hero but as a deeply tarnished figure. The Spanish people, either out of naivety or sheer desperation, greeted him as El Deseado, the desired one. That warm welcome was probably one of the biggest political mix-ups in Europe's history because Ferdinand quickly proved his time in France hadn't changed him one bit. His first move as restored king was to scrap the 1802 constitution, drawn up by the Cortes of Cádiz while he was gone, which captured the era's boldest liberal ideas. Ferdinand brought back a brutal absolute rule, hunted down liberals who'd fought for Spain's freedom, and unleashed a reign of terror that would have made even the worst despots jealous. But it was in his personal life that Ferdinand's most troubling quirks came to light. He tied the knot 4 times, each marriage sparking gossip, scandal, and talk of the king's apparent struggle to produce heirs. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, married him in 1791 but died in 1796 without kids, and whispers hinted the marriage was never consummated. His second bride, Isabella of Braganza, daughter of Portugal's king, wed him in 1806. Stunningly beautiful and sharp-witted, Isabella had no children in their 3-year marriage before her early death, fueling more palace rumors about the couple's private troubles. Ferdinand's third marriage, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was even more uneasy. A practical woman with a strong will, Maria Josepha tried every trick in the book to conceive, visiting doctors, praying special prayers, and making pilgrimages, but 7 years passed with no heir. Europe's royal courts started openly poking fun at the Spanish king's failure to do what was seen as a monarch's top job, securing the dynasty's future. During this time, the rumors about Ferdinand's masculinity got nastier and more pointed. Foreign diplomats, in their official reports, mentioned the king's unique challenges. Underground pamphlets in Madrid mocked his shortcomings. Some even suggested Ferdinand might have had physical defects from birth or that an illness had wrecked his ability to father children. Things got so awkward that when Maria Josepha died in 1819, Ferdinand, now 45, was all but pushed into a fourth marriage. The bride was his niece, Maria Cristina of Bourbon, Sicilies, 23 years younger, and the union felt like a last-ditch effort to save his reputation and produce an heir. To everyone's astonishment, Maria Cristina, Ferdinand's young fourth wife, conceived almost immediately after their marriage, defying the long-standing doubts about the king's ability to produce an heir. In October 1820, the royal couple welcomed Princess Isabella, and just 2 years later, in 1822, Princess Luisa Fernanda arrived, marking a sudden turn in Ferdinand's fortunes as a father. After 3 barren marriages that had fueled endless court gossip, Ferdinand finally had children to carry on his legacy. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, his obsessive quest for a male heir to secure the Bourbon dynasty was thwarted as both of his offspring were daughters, a fact that stung deeply in a society that prized male succession above all. You'd think the arrival of the princesses would have silenced the relentless rumors about Ferdinand's masculinity, but instead it only poured fuel on the fire, igniting fresh whispers across Madrid's palaces and taverns. Some malicious tongues suggested that the girls weren't even Ferdinand's, hinting that the vibrant young queen had taken a lover who was the true father, a scandalous accusation that spread like wildfire. Others speculated that Ferdinand had stumbled upon some groundbreaking medical remedy or that divine intervention, perhaps through fervent prayers or sacred relics, had miraculously restored his virility at the 11th hour. The most vicious gossip went even further, whispering that the king might have resorted to unnatural or forbidden methods to conceive. A notion so shocking in the rigid moral climate of 19th-century Spain that it underscored just how far his reputation had plummeted. In his final years, Ferdinand became a tragic, despised figure, a monarch whose once grand presence had withered into something pitiable, scorned by subjects who saw him as a shadow of royal dignity. His health crumbled rapidly under the weight of debilitating gout, chronic digestive ailments, and an obesity so severe that he was often confined to his canopied bed, surrounded by somber physicians and anxious attendants. His temperament, already unsteady in his prime, became a volatile storm, swinging unpredictably between bouts of crushing melancholy and sudden, terrifying outbursts of rage that sent shudders through the royal court, leaving even seasoned courtiers tiptoeing in fear. What stood out most starkly in Ferdinand's twilight days was his all-consuming obsession with proving his manhood, a fixation that seemed to define his every thought and action. Dusty medical records tucked away in the royal archives reveal how he relentlessly hounded his doctors with questions about his intimate capabilities, pleading for treatments or potions. Anything that might bolster his virility and cement his legacy as a potent king. Treatments to boost his sexual prowess and father more kids. He downed all sorts of concoctions, supposed love potions made from ground-up rhino horn to rare plant extracts shipped in from the Americas. This obsession with his masculinity seemed to fuel his growing political paranoia. Ferdinand was never a confident ruler, but in his last years he became consumed by the fear that his enemies were attacking not just his crown but his very manhood. He took any jab at his leadership as a direct insult to his virility, lashing out with a viciousness that stunned even the hard-hearted folks of his era. By September 1823, Ferdinand Vii's health had plummeted into a dire state, leaving him a shadow of the monarch he once aspired to be. His doctors, scrambling to make sense of his ailments, blamed a brutal combination of crippling gout, failing kidneys, and what we'd now likely recognize as advanced diabetes, a condition barely understood in the early 19th century. For months, he lingered in his opulent palace bedchamber, surrounded by heavy velvet curtains and the faint glow of oil lamps, caught between fever-fueled delirium and stark moments of lucidity where the cold reality of his approaching death gripped him. It was in the midst of this agonizing, drawn-out decline, with courtiers whispering nervously outside his door, that Ferdinand made a decision that would etch his name into history for the strangest of reasons. According to tales passed down through the years, still tormented by lifelong insecurities about his masculinity and the legacy he'd leave behind, he reportedly issued explicit instructions about how his body should be handled after his death. Some accounts insist that he, in a final act of defiance against the rumors that had plagued him, demanded his reproductive organ be preserved as a tangible symbol of his virility, a bizarre proof for posterity that he was, indeed, a man worthy of his crown. When Ferdinand VII finally slipped away on September 29, 1823, his lifeless body was handed over to the somber rituals of royal embalming, a meticulous process steeped in tradition, where skilled physicians carefully removed organs and treated the corpse with preservatives to prepare it for a grand state funeral that would honor Spain's fallen king. The legend that's dogged his name ever since claims that it was during this grim ceremony held in the flickering candlelight of the Madrid palace's stone-walled chambers, that an act so peculiar took place at birth, the most unforgettable and awkward rumor tied to Ferdinand's reign. The story's details shift like shadows depending on the teller, but the version that's echoed loudest through the ages holds that, either by Ferdinand's own dying command or the actions of a devoted ally acting on his behalf, his manhood was carefully severed during the embalming process and preserved in a fragile glass jar filled with clear alcohol like some ghastly trophy from a bygone era. This strange relic, according to the tale, was discreetly hidden away in the royal family's private vaults, locked behind heavy iron doors, meant to serve as a haunting monument to a king whose masculinity had been endlessly questioned. A desperate attempt to cement his potency in the annals of history. The first written traces of this outlandish story didn't surface until the late 19th century, roughly 60 years after Ferdinand's death, when whispers from the palace began to solidify into recorded history. In his sprawling national episodes, the renowned Spanish historian Benito Pérez Galdós slyly alluded to the peculiar fate of the remains of the king once hailed as the desired one, dropping just enough of a hint to stir curiosity without spelling it out. Other chroniclers of the era, like Ramón de Mesonero Romanos, wove similar cryptic references into their memoirs about the court of Ferdinand's daughter, Isabella II, painting a picture of a royal household still haunted by its former ruler's odd legacy. The tale crossed borders and gained a wider audience when the French novelist Alexandre Dumas, ever eager for a sensational scoop, recounted in his memoirs of traveling through Spain that he'd heard whispers of a curious royal artifact tucked away in the shadows of the Madrid palace. Known for his flair for drama, Dumas shared a story from a Spanish noble who described this last treasure of the Bourbon dynasty, unmistakably referring to the preserved organ with a mix of intrigue and amusement. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the story had taken on a life of its own, passed along by a parade of writers and journalists who couldn't resist its morbid allure. British author Gerald Brennan, in his vivid work The Spanish Labyrinth, wrote about picking up the tale while living in Spain during the 1920s, noting how it still buzzed among locals as a piece of scandalous folklore. American and French reporters passing through Madrid to cover the Spanish royal family often sprinkled mentions of the legend into their articles, treating it as a juicy tidbit that added a layer of intrigue to Spain's storied monarchy. What makes this tale so endlessly fascinating isn't whether it's fact or fiction, proving it one way or the other is next to impossible, but what it reveals about how Ferdinand VII was seen by his people and how Spain itself was perceived in his era. The fact that the story has endured, growing more elaborate and colorful with each retelling across generations, suggests it struck a deep chord, tapping into the collective unease about a king whose personal and political failings defined an empire in decline. The idea of preserving a dead king's private parts can be seen as a twisted symbol of a monarchy obsessed with power and heirs but blind to its real problems. Ferdinand spent his life fighting off rumors about his manhood and his ability to produce children. The notion that he'd try to prove his masculinity even after death by saving that particular organ makes a kind of warped sense, given his fixations. Plus, the legend mirrors the era's views on royal masculinity and political strength. In a society where a king's ability to father heirs was tied to his right to rule, an impotent or infertile monarch wasn't just a personal failure, it was a national crisis. Keeping the royal organ in this light would have been a frantic grab at holding onto some shred of dynastic credibility. The story also shows the biting edge of Spanish humor. The Spanish people, crushed under Ferdinand's brutal rule, found a way to mock him after his death through this legend. The idea that the only part of Ferdinand worth saving was the one tied to so many humiliating rumors is a clever kind of folk payback. From a historian's view, it's worth noting that no hard proof of this so-called relic has ever turned up. No official list of Spain's royal archives mentions such a thing, and even during the 20th century's political upheavals, when plenty of royal secrets spilled out, nothing solid about the jar ever surfaced. Scholars who've dug into the Spanish royal archives say they've never found papers backing the story. Likewise, none of the later Spanish kings ever spoke of this supposed relic, which you'd expect if it was real and mattered to the dynasty. The absence of hard evidence hasn't dimmed the strange allure of this tale one bit. If anything, the fact that we can't pin down whether it's true or not just makes it all the more gripping, like a mystery that keeps you hooked because it defies a clear answer. The story of Ferdinand Vii's supposed preserved organ has woven itself into the fabric of cultural folklore, outlasting cold hard facts to become a legend that feels almost alive. Back during the Spanish Civil War and the heavy-handed days of Franco's regime, this odd tale took on a sharp political edge. Left-leaning Republicans and communists latched onto it as a damning symbol of the monarchy's rot and ridiculousness, using it to paint the royal family as a relic of absurdity. Meanwhile, monarchists, desperate to protect the crown's dignity, did everything they could to shove the story under the rug or call it nonsense. Franco himself, a man obsessed with projecting strength and machismo, reportedly couldn't stand hearing about it and went out of his way to purge any mention of this embarrassing legend from Spain's official histories, as if silencing the tale could erase the stain on the monarchy's pride. Strangely enough, it was only after Franco's death in 1975, when Spain embraced democracy, that this wild story roared back to life with a vengeance. With the heavy yoke of censorship finally lifted, curious historians and bold journalists began poking into the shadowy corners of Spain's past, unearthing this bizarre anecdote like treasure hunters stumbling on a forgotten relic. Popular history books, flashy television documentaries, and even a few sensational films latched onto the legend, ensuring it became a permanent fixture in Spain's cultural imagination. The way this tale has clung to life over the years says a lot about how our views on sexuality, masculinity, and power have evolved. In the modern era, the notion of a king so consumed by his own manhood that he'd reportedly order his private parts preserved after death doesn't just come off as odd, it strikes us as deeply disturbed, almost pathological. This shift in perspective has transformed Ferdinand VII in the public's mind, turning him from a monarch who might have once been seen as a tragic figure weighed down by his flaws into a grotesque caricature, a man whose obsessions make him more pitiable than pitiful. Looking at it through a psychological lens, this legend sheds light on the warped nature of absolute power. Ferdinand VII is a textbook case of what happens when someone with total control lets personal hang-ups bleed into state affairs. His obsession with proving his manliness wasn't just a private quirk, it shaped Spain's policies at home and abroad. Compare him to someone like Louis XV of France, who lived around the same time and faced similar whispers about his virility but still managed to keep his royal dignity intact. The difference probably comes down to Louis earning respect for his smarts and political savvy, while Ferdinand was loathed for his spinelessness and betrayals. The tale of the supposed preserved organ also shows how 19th-century European monarchies struggled with social and political changes that made their old ways of justifying power feel outdated. Ferdinand's desperate need to prove his physical masculinity hinted at his gut-level sense that his royal authority was under fire. When it comes to his historical legacy, this legend did something none of his actual policies could: it made Ferdinand VII unforgettable. While his reforms, military choices, and economic moves are stuff only historians dig into, the story of his alleged preserved organ is known to anyone with a casual interest in Spain's past. Here's the ultimate twist: a king who was obsessed with his reputation and legacy is mostly remembered for a humiliating rumor about his private parts. That's got to be history's cruelest payback. He wanted to go down as a mighty, absolute ruler. Instead, he's the guy whose manhood was supposedly kept in a jar. The legend is a stark reminder of how fragile royal pride can be and how fast a reputation can turn into a punchline. Ferdinand died thinking he'd restored Spanish absolutism and secured the Bourbon dynasty's future. But just 35 years later, his daughter Isabella II was toppled by a revolution, and the Spanish monarchy faced one crisis after another through the 20th century. Nearly 200 years after Ferdinand Vii's death, the story of his supposed preserved organs still floats around on websites, in documentaries, and in quirky history books. It's become a fixture in Europe's royal mythology, right up there with tales like the Romanovs' hemophilia or the madness of England's George III. Whether Ferdinand's reproductive organ was actually preserved will probably never be confirmed. Spain's royal archives keep their secrets tight, and many records were lost or destroyed during the 19th and 20th centuries' upheavals. But maybe the literal truth matters less than the deeper truth this legend points to. At its heart, the story of the king with Europe's most infamous organ is a lesson about power, masculinity, and the emptiness of vanity. Ferdinand VII poured his life into proving his manhood and authority, only to end up a laughingstock for generations. If his organ really was kept in a jar, it'd just be the final, physical proof of a life squandered on shallow obsessions and pointless cruelties. In the end, the legend of Ferdinand VII shows us that history has a brutal way of cutting down those who care too much about their own greatness. The king who dreaded being mocked for his lack of masculinity became exactly that, not because his organ was preserved, but because his character and choices laid bare a deeper lack that no physical symbol could hide. History can't be preserved in a bottle, and it always finds a way to reveal the truth about those who try to control it.